Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of MECFS Alert. I'm delighted today to have an extraordinary thinker with me, a man who, a scientist, a man who has, like many of us, come to ME because of family tragedy or friends tragedy. He is Kenneth J. Friedman. He is an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Medicine at Rowan University's School of Osteopathic Medicine. Welcome, Ken. Tell us quickly a little bit about yourself and the tragedy that brought you to ME.
Well, I was a pharmacologist, physiologist at the New Jersey Medical School in Newark, New Jersey. And in the mid-1990s, my daughter became ill with an undiagnosed illness. Unfortunately, no one in my medical school was able to diagnose her. And so I ended up having to diagnose her myself. And the diagnosis that I came to was chronic fatigue syndrome. And at that time, there was very little available in terms of treatment. And at the time, she was in college, and it took her 6 years to get through college. She did improve somewhat and got a bit better and was able to work, I would say, for somewhere between 5 and 10 years. But she was working with great difficulty and at great personal cost. And then she crashed again, and she had to quit working, and we had to essentially bring her home. It took 2 years for her to get somewhat better, and she's now living on her own. But she lives a mostly indoor life. She can do very few things, and if she does those things, it's at a cost. So to help her and those like her, I began a journey of my own to initially explore the physiological basis of MECFS, because I was a physiologist. And I have been on that pursuit ever since.
Now, the battle has been joined, hasn't it, by COVID-19 and other diseases that we weren't paying attention to before, that have this remarkable thing that the residual symptoms are interchangeable with the symptoms of ME, fatigue, brain fog, the whole list, resistance or inability to hold a job and to do physical exercise. And I said hold a job, not in a normal pejorative way that is expressed. I probably shouldn't have said that, but to function as a normal human being. How many other diseases have you found are similar?
Well, we are about to explore that. In fact, the first job that we did was to document by meta-analysis, which is a scientific way of comparing symptoms. And in a themed issue that I was guest editor of, we asked for a paper to be produced. And fortunately, one of our New Jersey Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Association scholarship winners and her mentor, medical resident supervisor, produced a paper on meta-analysis of MECFS and long COVID, and showed a tremendous overlap of MECFS with long COVID. And in fact, now at a research conference just held last week, there is now further studies that document that long COVID and MECFS patients actually qualify for two case definitions of MECFS. It's not only the Institute of Medicine case definition that long COVID patients can satisfy, but it's also the earlier, stricter Canadian consensus case definition that long COVID patients satisfy. So on the basis of that, and for a topical collection that I am now editing, I have requested that at my own medical school, at the School of Osteopathic Medicine, that some of the residents there look into other diseases that are known to have chronic, long-lasting effects, and see if they can do a meta-analysis of those diseases and come to a similar understanding. So I have generated a list of potential diseases that may qualify, and they include Coxsackie B virus, Ebola, herpes viruses of various kinds, post-polio syndrome, which I presume, I don't think there's strong evidence yet, is a residual of the polio virus itself, Zika virus, bacterial infections such as untreated syphilis. I would like to explore fungal infections, because fungal infections are known to give symptoms very similar to MECFS. And in fact, we have some MECFS patients whose only known trigger are fungal infections. And then there are chemical and environmental toxins that may also produce MECFS and or long COVID symptoms. But because of this overlap of symptoms, I don't think that it is appropriate or proper to call these symptoms MECFS symptoms or long COVID symptoms. I think that all these diseases should be classified in their own category, which we have named as post-active phase infectious syndromes, which means that after the initial infection, there is an active phase. And if it's a viral disease, you can detect the viral disease by doing clinical laboratory tests such as blood work and finding the virus in the blood. And so that represents the active phase. But then when the active phase is gone, or when the virus is gone from the blood, and these patients are still exhibiting somewhat different but long-lasting symptoms, that would be the post-active phase of these infections. And I believe we have an opportunity now to create this category of diseases, put all these diseases that qualify into this category, and make a stronger approach for solving what is exactly the cause of these post-active phase symptoms.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, could you just explain to us the term meta a bit more? I don't think most people understand it. They hear it, but they don't quite understand it.
Well, a meta-analysis is a scientific approach. And I am, in fact, doing a meta-analysis for a review paper that I have been asked to write. And unfortunately, it is not as quiet, as scientific as one might hope, because there is a great deal of human judgment that has to come into play. But when one does a meta-analysis, and I'm going to defer from a precise definition and give you an operational definition, because I think that's probably more accurate. But what one does is one looks at the literature that exists on the topic, and then one sets up criteria based upon the literature that is on the topic and decides whether it meets your criteria for inclusion into the base of literature that you are going to analyze. And then you analyze that literature and see what that literature tells you. See if it supports any particular hypothesis or confirms any particular trend in terms of data analysis.
And as a physiologist, have you determined other ways of identifying ME other than through obviously the traditional biological sampling, which isn't working? bodily fluids, tissue, etc.
Unfortunately, even though I have been involved with MECFS for 30 years, the science of MECFS, due to a paucity of research funding, has not progressed sufficiently to the point where you can detect MECFS by other than these clinical tests. There are some experimental procedures that are now being tested. Again, at this meeting that was held last week, there are now some neuroimaging techniques that seem very promising. Neuroimaging techniques have been around in MECFS, I'm going to approximate, for 20 years. But because of the paucity of research funding, it hasn't progressed that far. But now, because of the presence of long COVID and the overlap, there is going to be an influx of money, hopefully for the joint investigation of both long COVID and MECFS.
I was at a conference last week myself, but this was to do with digitization of the utility industry. Except we did a tour of the labs at the Texas State University, and one of the lecturers, or one of the people giving us the tour, referred to diagnosis without biology, non-biological diagnosis. And I shot off an email before our broadcast, but I haven't heard back. But it did seem to me that clearly that may be necessary to find a and something a little simpler than putting somebody on a treadmill and seeing what happens when they collapse and for how long they collapse, which seems to me a rather brutal, if effective way.
Well, I think there are or will be simpler ways of doing it. I know that now, for example, there are many proteins in the blood. There are proteins that indicate inflammation. And based upon the profile or ratios of these various proteins in the blood, it is possible to come up with a profile that is indicative of the severity of MECFS that the patient currently has. And so there will come a time when we know enough about these proteins and other biomarkers such that one could take a drop of blood, put it on a slide, have the chemicals available on the slide to separate out and attach to these various proteins and come up with a profile that will indicate whether or not the patient has this or that disease.
Now, you have a book out, don't you, on a young person's primer on ME. Would you like to tell us about that?
Well, there are essentially several books. Back starting in 2014, we were writing the International Association for Chronic Fatigue Syndrome / Myalgic Encephalomyelitis primer, which was an adult primer, and that was followed in 2017 by a pediatric primer, which is available both as PDF and in hard copy. After that, I was asked to create a themed issue in the journal Frontiers on MECFS, and that is Advances in MECFS Research and Clinical Care, which is also available as a hardbound book. There is another issue that is going to be a book, and that is MECFS, the severe and very severely affected. It's available as a PDF, but it's not available in hard copy yet. And I'm working on another one right now. While we were writing the adult primer, it turns out that a board member of the New Jersey Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Association had a child, an adult child at that point, who had MECFS, who committed suicide. He had had enough and he wasn't getting the care that he needed. And so he decided that not living was the better alternative than living. And the day after he died, his mother called me and said that she wanted to donate his tissues to medical research, and could I tell her how to do that? And also that she wanted a pediatric primer to be written so that the care that her son did not get would be gotten by other children so that they would not have the tortured life that her son had. And so I assured her that as soon as I finished writing the adult primer, we would begin work on the pediatric primer. And that's how the pediatric primer got written.
How much infection, how much chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis have you seen among young people? I have interviewed a number of teenagers, and the situation is awful, perilous, and heartrending. Younger children I have not seen myself.
There are two age groups where MECFS is fairly pronounced. I would characterize those as being more on the adult side. In younger children, it is more rare, but when it happens in children, it can be very severe and very debilitating. The good news is that for the majority of them, they somehow are able to gain back most of their function. It is the relatively rare child that is unable to regain most of their function. But it does happen, and when it does happen, it's very sad.
With teenagers, it is the worst thing I've seen. Teenagers confined to bed or to wheelchairs. I've interviewed several of them. And of course, the burden on their parents is enormous, and everybody who loves and cares. Plus these lives that are not snuffed out, but have been put under glass, that people are alive, but they are not living in any large sense, in any normal sense. Sort of, they're there, hidden in plain sight, if you will. In the course of your research of these diseases that have similar or imitative indications to ME, have you found anything in common at the front end, like the moment of initiation, the moment of insult? Is there any commonality there? COVID, does it always begin with a flu-like symptom, as so often, so many people with myalgic encephalomyelitis say it was a case of the flu and then I never got better?
Right. So I should have mentioned that one of the symptoms that seems to have a great degree of overlap with MECFS is something called chronic Lyme disease, which obviously starts with Lyme disease. And the majority of these illnesses, the trigger is an infectious agent. So what you find is that the acute phase somehow involves an infection. Now, in Lyme disease, it's a bacterial infection, and in the others, long COVID and MECFS, or more likely or more accurately, MECFS is usually triggered by Epstein-Barr virus, although it can be triggered by other viral infections. You're going to see the symptoms of an infection. So that would be tiredness, a fever, some expression of inflammation. And then what I would say is that depending upon the trigger, there would be more specific trigger-induced symptoms. One thing that has not been done, or at least I haven't seen it, is that I have never seen studies of MECFS where the patients are characterized by their known initial trigger. In other words, would we get more precise characterization of the MECFS for patients who are exclusively known to have been initially infected by Epstein-Barr virus, as opposed to their initial infection being caused by a herpes virus?
These viruses, herpes and Epstein-Barr, do you postulate how they could have played a role where we've seen clusters, where we've seen a whole community get myalgic encephalomyelitis, which by and large is not an infectious disease. We don't have to put on masks to go in the sick room. We shake hands with patients. But you have these famous clusters, the one at the Royal Free Hospital in London and the one on Lake Tahoe and the one in upstate New York, where a large number of people were seemingly simultaneously affected, which suggests either an environmental agent or that you have a highly infectious virus running around.
That is true, and that is a great unknown. So at this point, I think the most reasonable thing to say is that there was a cofactor that induced MECFS in these groups of patients, and we have not identified them. You mentioned the upstate New York cluster, which is the Lindenville group, which was initially described by David Bell. And David was under the impression that it was initially caused by raw milk. That was the common factor that all these children had, namely that they had ingested raw milk for some time prior to their developing MECFS.
Well, I thought the very interesting thing was how poor it is in Lindenville. It's a hard scrabble part of the country. And the other outbreak, the one which really, where it first became known as chronic fatigue syndrome on Lake Tahoe, was one of the richest enclaves in the country, which makes it hard to detect any commonality of what people are drinking. I doubt people on Lake Tahoe were drinking raw milk. It just simply doesn't happen. They drink, treated pasteurized milk, because that's what richer people do. And it remains a great. Have you ever sort of wondered or thought, is this something we're not looking at? Is there a stone we have not turned over?
I have wondered, certainly. I do not know what it is. I think the important thing is to keep that cofactor possibility in mind. I think that the majority of research that has been done has ignored the cluster outbreak. Either that, or it has been used to suggest that MECFS is a psychological disease, and that what one person does is seen by another and then mirrored by that person for whatever reason they wish to do it.
The mass hysteria diagnosis.
Correct.
Which is hard to believe when you get people from the very young to the very old having the same being influenced by the same hysteria.
Well, that's what I think is
But
the advantage of this COVID, long COVID, I'm going to call it an epidemic, namely that it has become very clear that this is not a mass hysteria situation. And it's all over the world, and it's all over the world at the same time. And it is blind to socioeconomic status. So those people who want to claim that it is a psychological or psychiatric illness have a much more difficult time in explaining or justifying their hypothesis now than they did before. My hope was that we could put it to rest, but my understanding is that we have not quite done that.
Ken, I think what you're doing and what you're thinking about things not previously thought of in this way is hugely important and will have a very large impact. I think it deserves to. Is there some place where people can find your work or get in touch with you, say researchers who would like to talk to you?
They can reach me via email, which is my full name, Kenneth.J.Friedman, spelled Friedman, @gmail.com. I am on the board of the New Jersey Myalgic Encephalomyelitis Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Association, which has a website, so they can contact me through there. And that email or that website is njcfsa.org. So either of those would work.
Ken, thank you so much for spending this time with us. We wish you in your research the best of luck, and I know the entire patient community, all of those who are suffering, hope that you have great success in your research, in the original thinking that you have brought to it. And personally, and I'm sure on behalf of the entire audience, we hope that your daughter gets well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.